The plastic plate feels cold in my hand, its cheapness cutting through the holiday cheer. Still, I don't react. Just pick at the food, my grip tightening on the flimsy fork. As the laughter of my son and daughter-in-law drifts around me, the weight of the disrespect sinks in. While they bask in their perfect little world, I realize I'm no longer part of it. That's when I make my decision. I'll lock them out, just like they tried to lock me out. And the key? A plastic lock. Just like the plate they handed me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in a quiet winter haze. Marjorie's boots crunched over the icy path as she approached the front door, a couple of homemade pies wrapped carefully in a cloth tucked under her arm. The smell of cinnamon and apples wafted from them, a comfort she knew her son and his family would appreciate. She knocked twice, each rap sharp against the cold, though there was a lingering sense of anticipation in her chest. This would be the first Christmas in years where the family was all together, no empty spaces at the table. She hadn't been invited to many dinners recently, not since the tension between her and Dana had thickened like the winter frost. The door swung open with an abruptness that startled her, but there was no warmth in Connor's greeting. "Mom," he said, his tone just a little too flat, a little too quick. He stepped aside to let her in but didn't move to hug her. "Pies. Thanks." Dana appeared behind him, a tight smile barely curving her lips. "Hi, Marjorie," she said, with just the right amount of cheer to be considered polite. But there was no mistaking the subtle edge in her voice. She was in her perfect hostess mode, but it was strained, a facade. "We didn't expect you to bring anything, but that's sweet." Marjorie nodded, offering a soft smile in return. Her shoes clacked on the tiled floor as she followed them into the house, her gaze sweeping over the living room. The decorations were beautiful, as always. Dana had a knack for making everything look perfect, even if it felt cold and calculated. The tree, lit with small white lights, stood against the window, casting an ethereal glow on the room. A fire crackled in the hearth, a comforting sound, but not quite enough to erase the chill in the air. Her son's voice snapped her back to the present. "Here, Mom." Connor handed her a flimsy plastic plate and a plastic fork, the edges of both cheap and flimsy, bending slightly under the weight of her hand. Marjorie's fingers brushed the cold plastic, a slight frown pulling at the corner of her mouth, but she didn't say a word. She looked at the plate and then back up at him, noticing the flicker of irritation in his eyes. The same irritation that always seemed to simmer beneath the surface whenever she was around. Dana waved a hand dismissively. "There's not enough room at the main table?" she explained in an exaggerated tone, like it was all some kind of joke. She pointed across the room to a folding table tucked in the corner, just big enough for Ellie and the two of them to sit at. "You're fine over there, Mom." Marjorie didn't argue. She knew better. She'd stopped fighting long ago. Instead, she moved quietly to the table, sitting down in the chair they'd set aside for her. It wasn't comfortable, but she didn't expect comfort anymore. Not from them. Ellie, her granddaughter, hovered in the doorway for a moment, her wide eyes catching Marjorie's. She looked embarrassed, ashamed even. The girl wanted to say something, Marjorie could tell, but her gaze shifted downward. Ellie was a good kid, too soft for the world that had shaped her parents, too smart to miss the dynamics that played out every time the family gathered. Marjorie picked up her fork, lifting a bite of turkey to her mouth. The taste was fine, though the texture of the cheap plastic fork scraping against her teeth was unsettling. She chewed slowly, her thoughts drifting as she observed the scene before her. Dana and Connor exchanged glances, laughter falling from their lips, all the while unaware of how shallow their joy truly was. Marjorie, on the other hand, had seen it all before, the forced cheer, the hollow gestures, the pretense of connection. Christmas to them was a performance. And as they made small talk, Dana's voice sliced through the air, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We didn't have enough real plates," she laughed, a hollow sound, like a brittle piece of glass being dropped onto the floor. "Can't be helped, right?" Marjorie's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but she said nothing. The words lingered in the air like smoke, too thin, too fleeting to catch. But they hung there nonetheless. Her mind wandered back to the years when Christmas had been different. When the house had felt full, not just of people, but of something deeper. Something that hadn't been cheapened by convenience and disregard. Back then, she'd been a part of the table, not a prop. Her eyes flickered to Ellie, who still seemed unsure of how to act, torn between the old warmth she remembered and the new, colder reality of her family. But as Marjorie looked around the room, the truth became clearer than ever. She was no longer part of the family's real table. And she was done pretending she didn't notice. Marjorie sat in the dim light of her living room, the house still quiet after the distant echoes of Christmas dinner had faded away. The fire had long since died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a low, orange flicker across the room. She had barely touched her slice of pie, letting the soft music playing from the radio accompany her thoughts as she pulled the folder from the drawer beside her chair. The papers inside were thick, edged with the faint smell of old leather, but Marjorie knew them well. She had kept them close for a reason, because they were hers. Every detail, every line was etched into her memory. She began flipping through the documents slowly, one by one. The first page was the property title, clear and official, her name alone on it. Marjorie Ellis, sole owner. The ink was faded in places, but the words were clear. Beneath that, the deed to the house. Signed, stamped, and recorded all those years ago. She wasn't sure why she had kept them. Maybe, on some level, she had known this day would come. Maybe she had always known that she would need proof one day, that she would need to remind herself of who she was in a house that had started to feel less like hers and more like a stage for everyone else's drama. She paused for a moment, her fingers tracing the words, her home, her roof. Yet the way they had treated her, the way they had treated this space as if it belonged to them, was a betrayal she hadn't been able to put into words until now. The plastic plate, the folding table, the distance they had created between her and the family table. It wasn't just about dinner. It was about everything they had taken for granted, everything they had forgotten. The silence of the house was broken by a knock on the door. Marjorie blinked, then stood slowly, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She closed the folder and tucked it back into the drawer, though she knew she'd return to it soon. She crossed the room, her steps quiet, and opened the door. Frank stood on the porch, his heavy coat dusted with snowflakes. The lines on his face deepened in the low light, his white hair bright against the darkness. He looked concerned, his eyes searching her face, but he didn't say anything right away. "Frank," she said, her voice gentle, though she couldn't hide the weariness in it. "Come in, I didn't expect you." He stepped inside without waiting for a second invitation, and Marjorie closed the door behind him. The warmth from the fire brushed against her skin, but it wasn't enough to chase the chill in her bones. "You left your porch light on," Frank said, his tone carrying the weight of unspoken concern. "I thought I'd check in." "You didn't answer the phone." "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. She walked toward the living room and gestured for him to sit. Frank lowered himself into the armchair by the fire, his eyes still lingering on her, but he didn't press further. Marjorie stood at the window for a moment, looking out into the quiet, snow-covered street. It was a familiar sight, one she had seen countless times, but tonight, the stillness felt different. She turned back to him, her hands shaking just slightly as she folded them in front of her. I need to tell you something, Frank, she said. Something I didn't want to admit before. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Connor and Dana, they don't know the truth. She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for the weight of her words. The house. The house is mine. It's always been mine. Frank didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the soft creak of the leather filling the silence. Finally, he nodded slowly. They forgot who owns the roof, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of quiet understanding. Marjorie's chest tightened, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. She had known it was true, but hearing someone else acknowledge it made the reality of it all settle into her bones. I don't know when it happened, Frank, she said, her voice shaking now. When did it all change? When did I stop being part of the family and just become a fixture in the background? It's like I'm invisible to them now. Frank didn't reply, but his eyes were soft with something that felt like sympathy. It was the kind of sympathy she hadn't wanted, but knew she'd need. I've been too quiet for too long, she murmured, more to herself than to him. I've let them walk all over me. Frank stood up, moving closer to her. He reached out, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. No more silence, Marjorie, he said, his voice low and steady. No more pretending. She nodded, feeling the truth of his words like a breath she had been holding for too long. Marjorie walked back to the desk and pulled open the drawer again, retrieving the original renovation receipts she had kept all these years. Each one told a story. Each one was a reminder of the work she had put in. The new roof, the updated plumbing, the fresh coat of paint on every wall. All of it, paid for by her hands, with her money. Do you still have them? Frank asked quietly, nodding toward the papers in her hand. She looked down at the receipts, feeling the weight of each one, a quiet declaration of ownership, of sacrifice. I've kept everything, she said, in case they ever needed to remember. He didn't say anything in response, but the way he looked at her told her that he understood. The world was changing, and so was she. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, the soft sound marking the passage of time. Marjorie placed the receipts on the table, beside the deed, where the weight of their truth could settle in for good. Marjorie sat at her kitchen table, the soft glow of the morning sun spilling over the papers in front of her. The documents were neatly laid out, each one a quiet reminder of the truth she had long known but never truly embraced. Her fingers traced the edges of the deed again, the ownership clear in the sharp, undeniable words. Her name. There was no disputing it. She had spent years tiptoeing around the edges of her own life, watching as others took what she had built, as if it belonged to them. But today, with the weight of the documents in front of her, she felt the power shift. It was time to stop hiding. Her phone rang, a single sharp tone breaking through the stillness of the room. She glanced at the screen, then answered without hesitation. Renee, Marjorie greeted her, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. I have everything, Marjorie, Renee said, her tone brisk but professional. I've reviewed the paperwork. The house is yours. There's no question about it. She paused, as if considering her next words carefully. You hold every right here, not just the house, but everything that comes with it. It's time to make sure they know that. Marjorie's hand clenched around the phone and she nodded, though Renee couldn't see her. What do we need to do next? Renee's voice was already more businesslike, more detached. We'll need to update the access policies, put everything in a trust, make sure they don't have automatic rights anymore. I'll draft the papers for the trust, and we'll add specific clauses about access. You can change the locks. We'll make it official. Marjorie's throat tightened. She had never imagined it would come to this legal battle over something she should have had from the beginning. But now it felt inevitable, like the next step in the story of her life. She thought back to the Christmas dinner, the plastic plates, and how they had treated her as if she were just a guest in a house that was, in truth, hers. They had assumed they could walk all over her, taking advantage of her silence. But not anymore. "I want to make sure it's all ironclad," Marjorie said, her voice firm now, the decision solidifying within her. "I've already started writing a timeline of everything they've done, all the disrespect, the little jabs, the dismissals." Renee paused for a moment. "Good. That's exactly what we need. Documentation. That will strengthen your case if it ever comes to a legal dispute." As she spoke, Marjorie pulled open another drawer and retrieved the notebook she had started filling months ago. It was a small leather-bound journal, now well worn, the pages filled with notes, dates, and sharp recollections. She flipped to the first page, reading over the entries. "Dana snapped at me for no reason. Connor ignored my suggestions for the house renovations. They told me I was too old to understand when I questioned the way things were being handled." Each entry seemed to breathe with the humiliation of the past years spent on the sidelines of her own life. "I'll get the filings ready," Renee continued, her voice pulling Marjorie back into the present. "I'll prepare everything we need. We'll file with the county recorder's office and make sure everything is legally binding. No more pretending. They can't get away with this." Marjorie closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, her fingers lingering for a moment on the edges of it. The next step was clear. She needed to protect herself, protect what was rightfully hers. After hanging up with Renee, she moved to the next task, securing her documents. She walked to the living room and sat down at the desk where the deed and receipts still sat, untouched for the last few days. Her eyes scanned over them once more, the faint marks from years of handling barely visible now. There was no turning back. She'd always kept her valuables close, hidden in cabinets and drawers. But this felt different. She needed something stronger, something more permanent, a fireproof safe. She stood and dialed the number for the local store, giving them her order for a small, secure, fireproof safe. It would fit everything she needed: her documents, the trust papers once they were finalized, and her sense of security. The sound of the safe being delivered would be the final piece of the puzzle. Once everything was locked away, it would feel real, like the ownership of the house was not just something on paper, but something she could physically hold in her hands. As she hung up the phone, a thought crossed her mind, one she hadn't fully processed until now. She was no longer just a victim of their neglect and disrespect. She was the one who had the power. They might have thought they were in control, that they had ownership over her, over the house. But now, she was the one holding all the keys. The wind bit at Marjorie's cheeks as she stepped out into the quiet of the afternoon. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily from the sky, settling on the ground and adding another layer to the world that felt already coated in a quiet, thick layer of distance. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the weight of it grounding her, the chill reminding her that the world hadn't changed, even if hers had. She didn't respond to the voicemail. She couldn't. Connor's voice had been urgent, tinged with something she couldn't quite place, a mix of guilt and frustration, maybe. He wanted an explanation, but Marjorie wasn't ready to give him one. The last thing she needed was to justify her actions to him. Her boots crunched over the snow-covered sidewalk, the sound sharp and lonely. She hadn't gone for a walk in days, maybe weeks. Between the holidays, the stress, the constant hum of unfinished business, she had let herself become too tangled in the mess. But today, she felt a shift. Today, she needed clarity. As she walked, the sharpness of the cold air helped clear her mind. She thought about the house. Her house. It had always been her sanctuary. A place where she had poured years of work and care, where she had raised Connor, even when things weren't easy. And now it felt more like a battleground. The thin veneer of civility between her and Dana, the tension that had always been there with Connor, had finally snapped. The plastic plate, the folding table. It wasn't just a moment of disrespect. It was everything that had been building beneath the surface for years. She paused on the edge of the cul-de-sac, looking at the rows of houses, the soft yellow light spilling out from their windows. Their perfect little world. Their perfect little facade. But none of it mattered. It was all just smoke and mirrors. The phone in her pocket buzzed, jarring her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, seeing Ellie's name on the screen. She felt her chest tighten. A soft ache spreading through her as she swiped to open the message. "You okay? That wasn't right." Ellie. Always the quiet one, the one who noticed everything and said nothing. Marjorie's heart swelled with affection, mixed with a sharp pang of sadness. How had it come to this? How had the family become so fractured that even the youngest, the most innocent, saw it? She didn't want to involve Ellie in the adult mess, didn't want to pull her into the conflict that was slowly becoming too heavy for her own shoulders. But the words weighed on her as she stopped walking, leaning against a snow-dusted fence. The streetlights flickered on in the distance, casting long shadows across the snow. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just taking a walk. I'll be fine." She typed quickly, her fingers feeling stiff in the cold. "Don't worry about me." She paused before hitting send, her thumb hovering over the screen. Ellie deserved better. She deserved to know the truth, to know that it wasn't her fault. But Marjorie couldn't burden her with all of it. Not yet. Not until the time was right. Instead, she sent the message, hoping Ellie could read between the lines, could feel the love and reassurance that Marjorie could not put into words. With a deep breath, Marjorie pocketed the phone and turned back, heading for home. She walked slowly, lost in her thoughts. Frank's voice echoed in her mind. No more silence. The words felt like a constant drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. He had been the one to push her to take action, to stop letting things slip by. And now she could see it all so clearly. She was not just standing up for herself. She was standing up for her legacy, for the house, for the life she had built. Back at home, she found Frank sitting in the living room, his brow furrowed as he scanned a set of blueprints and notes. His sharp mind was always 2 steps ahead, and it was clear he had already started on the next phase. "We'll need to install the new locks," he said without looking up. "I've already mapped out the best spots, and we'll add cameras too, just to be sure." Marjorie nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you think?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Frank glanced up at her, his face unreadable. "I think it's time to make sure there's no more access, to keep things secure." She felt a quiet satisfaction at his words, though it was tempered with a tinge of sadness. How had it come to this? How had it come to a place where she had to take such drastic measures? But the realization was clear. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. As she moved to sit beside him, she glanced at the stack of papers on the coffee table. Among them was the trust paperwork. Renee had promised to finalize everything, to make sure it was ready to be filed. She didn't know how long it would take. Weeks, maybe months. But she could feel the change happening. Slowly, but surely. The morning light was muted, a pale gray that hinted at the snowstorm gathering on the horizon. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, the papers before her heavy with finality. The property trust documents. The ones that would change everything. The ones that would ensure she had the power. Not just in name, but in practice. She traced the bold, official letters of her name at the top of the document, already feeling the weight of the decision. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about control, dignity, and a future she could call her own. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she poised it over the line, ready to make her mark. The words on the page were clear and firm. Connor and Dana removed entirely. She had thought long and hard about it, and while the decision had been difficult, the reason was crystal clear. They had pushed her out of her own life, her own space, treating her as if she didn't matter. It had gone too far. With one smooth motion, Marjorie signed her name. A small sigh escaped her lips as the pen left the paper. There was no going back now. The ink was permanent. She looked at the signature, the weight of it settling into her bones. Frank stood in the doorway, his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. He had been with her every step of the way, watching her process each moment of this transformation. But now, there was something different in his gaze. Pride, perhaps. Or maybe just a quiet understanding of what this all meant. "You've done it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a weight of its own. He stepped into the room and picked up the document, glancing over it one last time. Marjorie nodded, her heart still steady, her mind clear. "It's done. The house is mine. Legally. Fully." He placed the papers in front of her. "It's not just the house. It's the control over everything, over your future. No one can take that away from you now." Marjorie felt a flicker of something in her chest, something that felt like relief mixed with satisfaction. She'd taken back her life, piece by piece. Her control. Her rights. Frank pulled a small, worn notebook from his jacket pocket. He'd been working on it for weeks. His blueprint for securing her space. As he opened it, Marjorie saw a list of detailed steps: new locks to be installed, security cameras to be placed, access restrictions, everything accounted for. "I've already made the calls," Frank said, looking up from the page. "The locksmith will be here tomorrow. The cameras will be installed next week. And I've already contacted the local insurance agency about updating your policy." Marjorie glanced at the schedule, her eyes resting on the handwritten notes. Frank had been thorough. He always was. This wasn't just a reaction to the past few weeks. It was a well-laid plan, a careful strategy to ensure there were no cracks for Connor and Dana to slip through. She pushed the documents aside for a moment, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the leather journal she had kept for years. The one filled with receipts, notes, and the quiet, unspoken history of everything she had built. She hadn't looked at it in a while, but now it felt like an anchor. She felt ready for the next step. Just as she was about to return her focus to the documents, her phone buzzed across the table. She picked it up without thinking, seeing Renee's name flash across the screen. Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The final piece. She answered quickly. "Renee? I've filed everything." Renee's voice was crisp, businesslike, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something that felt like relief on her end as well. "The trust has been registered with the county. Everything is official." Marjorie's breath caught in her throat, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the news settle in. It was done. The power had shifted. "Thank you," Marjorie said softly, her voice steady. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Of course," Renee replied, a hint of warmth threading through her professional tone. "Just remember, this is only the beginning. Now that it's in place, you'll need to enforce the rules. Make sure they know you're serious." "I will," Marjorie said, glancing at Frank, who gave her a small, approving nod. The conversation ended, and the weight of the moment pressed into Marjorie's chest. She placed the phone down, eyes falling to the stack of paperwork in front of her. But there was one more thing to do. She reached into the drawer, pulling out the old access agreements, those flimsy, out-of-date documents that had once granted Connor and Dana access to the house, to her life. She flipped through them one last time, the signatures that had once seemed so final now feeling like an empty gesture. With deliberate slowness, Marjorie began to shred them, The shredder hummed to life, devouring the pages in quick, rhythmic bursts. As each document was shredded, Marjorie felt the finality of it. Like each shred was a thread pulled from the tapestry of her old life, the life where she had been silenced, where she had allowed others to walk all over her. She leaned back in her chair once the last document had disappeared, the sound of the shredder now silent. "I'm not giving them any more chances," she whispered to herself. "No more access. No more control." Marjorie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone as it buzzed again. It was a silent invitation, a summons from Connor, another desperate plea for answers that she didn't owe him. She had already heard his voice on the voicemail, that mix of frustration and confusion, the tone that begged for an explanation, a justification for what she had done. But she wasn't ready to give him one. Not today. Not ever. The call went unanswered. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, a small flicker of hesitation crossing her mind. But then the thought of him, the way he had looked at her with that condescending pity, the way he had dismissed her at Christmas, made the decision final. She swiped the screen off and set the phone face down on the table. There was nothing more to say. Across the room, Frank was adjusting the placement of a lock, his movements slow and deliberate. The new locks were sleek, modern, and silent. No clunky keychain to jingle, no creaky metal to betray their presence. Just smooth, unbreakable security, locking her house and her life away from anyone who didn't belong. Marjorie watched him work for a moment, his careful hands, his methodical focus. He didn't need to ask her about the call. He already knew. He had been here for every step of this, his support unwavering. The security measures had been part of the plan from the start, every detail accounted for. Frank was a man of action, and his actions spoke louder than any words she could muster. She could feel the finality of it, the doors closing, literally and figuratively, on the world she had once allowed to overwhelm her. She had made her decision, and now she was building a wall around it. A wall that no one would be able to breach. As Frank tightened the final bolt, the house felt different. More secure. More like hers. Her phone buzzed again. A new notification this time. She glanced at it, not expecting anything important, but when she saw the name, she felt the familiar flicker of irritation in her chest. It was Dana, a post, public, on social media. Some people get older and think the world revolves around them. The mood swings are getting unbearable. Can't handle the drama anymore. Just want peace. Marjorie stared at the words, the thinly veiled jab. Dana's passive-aggressive attempt to manipulate the situation, to paint her as the unreasonable one. As if the real problem was Marjorie's mood swings instead of the years of disrespect she had endured. She exhaled slowly, feeling the sting of the words, but not the power they once held over her. Not anymore. It didn't matter what Dana posted. It didn't matter how Connor tried to explain himself. The truth had already been written. The documents had been signed. The locks had been changed. And she had no intention of returning to the space she had once shared with them, emotionally, physically, or otherwise. Marjorie put the phone down, her hands steady, her resolve firm. She made her way to the kitchen, grabbing a mug from the cupboard. She filled it with cocoa, watching the dark liquid swirl in the cup, its warmth rising to meet her skin. The smell of chocolate filled the air, a comfort, a small reprieve from the weight of the world that had been pressing on her. The flickering light of the fire in the living room cast a soft glow over everything. It was peaceful now, quiet. She settled into her favorite armchair, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as she took a slow sip. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, the storm moving in, but inside, it was calm. It was safe, and she was in control. The phone buzzed once more. Another attempt from Connor. She didn't need to check it. The voicemail would be just like the others. An apology wrapped in a demand, a plea for forgiveness, a request for understanding. She knew the pattern by now, but it didn't matter. Marjorie took another sip of cocoa, the warmth spreading through her, bringing a sense of contentment that had eluded her for so long. It was a simple act, but it felt like a victory. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the house, her house, felt more like home than it had in years. She was no longer the background character in her own life. She had reclaimed her space, her power, and the respect that had been so long denied to her. And now, she could finally breathe. The voicemail came just as the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows with an eerie force. Marjorie heard it vibrate on the kitchen counter, and then, the tone of Connor's voice filled the air. "Mom, what the hell happened? You can't just change things like this. What changed? I need to know what's going on. Call me back." His words were sharp, jagged, each one dripping with frustration. There was a note of panic in his voice now, something she hadn't heard before. The calm arrogance had cracked, replaced with a rawness that told her he didn't understand, that he didn't want to understand. Marjorie let the voicemail play through, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her mug, the warmth of the cocoa no longer enough to quiet the tension in her chest. He wasn't looking for an explanation. He was looking for control. Control over her decisions, over the choices she had made. But she wasn't going to give it to him. Not this time. After the message ended, she picked up the phone, her thumb hovering over the delete button. But something stopped her. Instead, she hit save instead of delete, and the voicemail went into the folder where it would stay, untouched. Evidence for the future, should she need it. Across the room, Frank was still working. He'd been moving through the house like a shadow, updating the camera feeds, making sure the new locks were fully integrated, and verifying that no one would have access unless he or Marjorie gave it. He was meticulous, ruthless in his dedication to ensuring their security, and now he turned toward her with a silent nod, acknowledging the voicemail without needing to say a word. Frank was practical. The message had been heard. It was over. Marjorie felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Connor's panic wasn't something she had to deal with anymore. She had played her part, and now it was their turn to face the consequences of their actions. But there was still more to do. She still had to finish securing her peace. She walked into the utility room and stood in front of the bank of switches, each one controlling a part of the house. The lights, the water, the heat. All these utilities, which had once been shared, by unspoken agreement between them, were now under her control. She reached out and flipped the switch on the backup power source. Their access was gone. Another layer of control was solidified. When she returned to the living room, Frank had finished the last of the updates to the cameras. They now had full coverage of every angle, every entry point. There was nowhere they could hide or sneak in. "They're secure," Frank said, his voice soft but authoritative. He was standing near the front door now, looking out at the street, where the storm had started to settle into a steady, swirling flurry of snow. "Nothing gets in without us knowing." Marjorie nodded, her gaze moving to the front porch. She could feel the stillness of the world outside pressing against her. The house, the new locks, the updates to her security. They had all created an impenetrable fortress. But there was one more thing she needed to do. One last act of closure. She sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out a blank sheet of paper and a pen. The words came to her easily, flowing with the simple clarity of love and concern. A letter. To Ellie. She took her time, writing slowly. She knew that Ellie would understand. It wasn't that she wanted to pull her granddaughter into the middle of everything. Far from it. Ellie was young, too young to be caught up in the ugly details of family conflict. But Marjorie needed her to know that she wasn't alone, that she was still loved, and that this was not her fault. Dear Ellie, I know you're probably confused right now, and I want to make sure you understand that none of this is your fault. You are not a part of the reason things have turned out this way. You are loved deeply, and I'm proud of the young woman you are becoming. Just know that your grandmother is always here for you, no matter what happens. Take care of yourself, and always remember to trust your heart. With all my love, Grandma. The letter felt like a release, a letting go of the emotional weight she had been carrying for far too long. Marjorie folded it carefully, slipping it into an envelope. She would send it when the time was right, when Ellie could read it without the added burden of family chaos. Marjorie stood up and walked to the front door, opening it just enough to hear the wind howling outside. The world beyond her house was a storm, but inside, the calm was settling deeper into her bones. The decisions she had made, the steps she had taken, they were hers, and they were final. She sat on the porch, her feet resting on the edge of the step, feeling the cold bite at her exposed skin. The world was silent except for the sound of the snow drifting down. The house behind her was hers, truly hers. The peace she had so longed for was within her reach. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years she felt like she could face whatever came. The phone buzzed again, a familiar sound that had once been a constant source of stress. This time, she didn't look. She simply watched the snow fall, waiting for the storm to pass. The post appeared just as Marjorie was setting the cup down on the kitchen counter. The warm glow of the stove light flickered in her peripheral vision, but the steady, almost mechanical buzz of her phone drew her eyes to the screen. It was from Dana. Some people get older and think the world revolves around them. The mood swings are unbearable. Can't handle the drama anymore. Just want peace. The message was public, a subtle weapon wrapped in a faux innocent sentiment. The words stung like a slap, but Marjorie had already learned to shield herself from the sharp edges of Dana's passive-aggressive posts. It didn't matter anymore. Dana's attempt to paint her as the villain wasn't new. It was just the latest in a long line of manipulative gestures meant to make Marjorie feel small, to make her feel as if she were the one causing the rift. Marjorie's fingers tightened around the phone, a quiet fire building inside her. But she didn't react. She couldn't. Not anymore. She heard Frank's voice from the other room, calm but insistent. "I've got it saved," he said, as he tapped away on his own phone, capturing a screenshot of Dana's post. "Proof, if you need it." Marjorie nodded. "It's not about proving anything anymore," she said, her voice steady. "But save it, just in case." Frank gave a small grunt of approval, his hands already at work on the next task. He was always prepared. He had the tools, the mindset, and the discipline to turn her vulnerability into something she could hold, something she could secure. Frank was a man who acted, and right now his every action was about ensuring that no one could undermine Marjorie again. Just as Frank began to walk away, there was a knock at the door. A soft rap, almost tentative, like a hesitant knock on the door of a stranger. Marjorie's heartbeat picked up slightly. It was late afternoon, too early for it to be too dark outside. Yet the chill from the wind that blew through the crack of the door told her the storm was only getting worse. But it wasn't the weather that made her pause. It was the suddenness of the knock. She walked toward the door, her mind already racing with possibilities. It could be Connor, or maybe even Dana, trying to make their way back into her life. But no, it was Ellie. The girl stood in the doorway, looking both unsure and concerned, her features a mix of worry and confusion. She was dressed warmly, a scarf pulled tight around her neck, and she held something in her hand, a small sketchbook. "Grandma." Ellie's voice was soft, her eyes searching Marjorie's face as if trying to read something hidden behind the calm exterior. "Can I come in? I just wanted to check on you." Marjorie felt a gentle pang in her chest at the sight of her granddaughter, standing there so uncertain. Ellie was the only one who hadn't treated her like an inconvenience. The only one who hadn't made her feel like she didn't belong. "Of course, sweetheart," Marjorie said, her voice warm, pulling the door open wider. "Come on in." Ellie stepped inside, her boots leaving small prints on the hardwood floor. She hesitated, then walked over to the couch, sitting down without another word. She didn't ask about the post, didn't question Marjorie directly. Instead, Ellie seemed to be waiting, watching, as if she could sense the weight of the things that had been left unsaid. "How's your mom?" Marjorie asked, her voice gentle, though the question felt heavy in the silence between them. She knew that Ellie was likely struggling with the tension, just as she had all those years ago when the house had felt full of unspoken grudges. Ellie looked up at her eyes troubled. "Mom's spiraling," she said softly. "She keeps talking about how you're just too difficult to deal with. That everything's falling apart because of you, but—" Ellie paused, chewing on her lip, clearly conflicted. "I don't think that's it. I don't think you're the one making everything crazy." Marjorie's heart swelled with emotion at Ellie's words, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to shift. She wanted to reach out, to pull the girl into her arms and reassure her that everything would be okay, that she wasn't alone in any of this. But Ellie needed more than reassurance. She needed understanding. "I'm not angry with your mom, Ellie," Marjorie said quietly, her hands folded together. "But I had to do what was right for me. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. And sometimes, when you finally stop pretending, people don't like it. They want things to stay the way they've always been. But sometimes, they can't." Ellie nodded slowly, absorbing her words. There was a deep sadness in her expression, but also a quiet understanding. She had already seen too much, felt too much, to be fooled by the facades her parents put up. Marjorie reached out, placing a hand on Ellie's. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'm safe, and I'm loved. Don't you worry about me, okay? I'll be fine." Ellie gave a small, uncertain smile, squeezing her grandmother's hand before standing up. "I just wanted you to know I'm here, Grandma. And I don't think you're the problem." The doorbell rang as Ellie moved toward the door. It was sudden, sharp in the stillness. Marjorie froze, her heart racing, a tight knot forming in her stomach. She didn't expect anyone, except maybe Dana. But Dana wouldn't ring the bell. She would barge in like she owned the place. Ellie turned toward the door, a quiet frown on her face. "Who is it?" Marjorie glanced at the clock. It was late enough that it could be anything, a final twist in the evening's strange unfolding. She walked toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. Her hand rested on the handle, her breath steady despite the uncertainty flooding through her. The sun had long set, and the storm outside was beginning to recede, but the air inside the house felt heavy. Marjorie sat in her study, a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house, where she had always done her paperwork, where she had lived her quiet life, behind the scenes of everyone else's dramas. The silence was comforting. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater and the occasional crackle from the fireplace in the next room. She had just finished reviewing the attorney's letter. Renee had sent it that afternoon, her words sharp and methodical. It was a response to Connor's recent frantic inquiries. The letter from the attorney had come, not as a courtesy, but as a reminder. A reminder that Connor and Dana had overplayed their hand. The letter was shallow, misinformed, and written with a tone of desperation. It painted Marjorie's actions as unprovoked and unreasonable, as if she had suddenly snapped. It hinted at challenges to the property trust, suggesting that they could contest the changes she had made to the house's ownership. But what it didn't account for, what it couldn't understand, was the legal firepower Marjorie now had on her side. She had been preparing for this moment. As Renee had promised, she had all the documents ready. Trust documents, property records, proof of ownership. Marjorie's name was on everything. Everything. Connor and Dana had no claim. Their attempts to overturn the situation would go nowhere. Marjorie slid the letter across the table to Frank, who had been sitting with her, scanning the paperwork, his expression unreadable. He picked it up, scanning it quickly before meeting her gaze. "They have nothing," Frank said, his voice low, as if the words themselves might be too heavy. "This is just noise. It's not even close." Marjorie nodded, her fingers lightly tapping on the armrest of her chair. She felt a quiet sense of relief settle in her chest, but also something sharper. Something like regret. She had always kept the peace, always tried to smooth things over, but peace had never been something she'd gotten in return. She leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "They'll be back. I know they will. But it doesn't matter anymore." Frank's eyes softened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he quietly filed the documents in the folder, closing it with finality. As if in agreement, Marjorie moved to the back of the study where the donation box sat. It was neatly packed with items she had been planning to part with for a while. Old decor, trinkets, and photos that no longer fit the life she was trying to build. It was all sentimental clutter, things that had once felt like a connection to her family, to her old life, but now felt like nothing more than reminders of a past she was done carrying. She opened the box and gently placed the items inside. The porcelain figurines Dana had bought on impulse during a trip to the coast. The ornate mirror they had argued over for months, until Dana decided to hang it in the entryway, only to have it collect dust. Marjorie could almost hear Dana's voice now, the way she'd insisted on decorating the house to look perfect. How every piece of decor had been chosen to project an image of success, of wealth, of power. Not a single thing was ever for the sake of real connection. Marjorie closed the box with a firm, deliberate motion. She felt no nostalgia, no sadness, only resolve. She was done trying to hold on to a past that hadn't truly belonged to her. As she moved toward the desk, she felt the weight of the trust documents in her hands again. There was one last thing to do. She reached for her will. Her pen hovered over the final, crucial sections. She had already updated the beneficiaries once, but now it was time to take the final step. The last thing she needed was for her decisions to be contested again. She knew the damage Connor and Dana were capable of, their need for control, their ability to twist the truth to their advantage. They couldn't be allowed to have any claim on her life, her home, her legacy. She scribbled quickly, her hand steady despite the emotional weight of it. "Remove Connor and Dana." She underlined the words twice. Once the ink was dry, she tucked the document into the folder with everything else. The finality of it settled on her like a blanket, warm and comforting. She could feel the weight of the past, of their control, sliding off her shoulders. This was hers, her house, her life. As she was about to close the folder, a small ping echoed from her phone on the desk. She reached for it, her heart quickening in anticipation. It was a message from Ellie. "I drew you a picture. I hope it makes you smile. You're not alone. You're always loved." Marjorie opened the attachment, her breath catching in her throat. Ellie had drawn a picture of her, Marjorie, standing tall and proud, holding a set of keys in her hand. The keys glimmered in the drawing, as if they were the key to her freedom, to her future. Ellie had seen it. She understood, even without the words. Tears blurred the edges of Marjorie's vision, but she smiled. Ellie was the only one who had always seen her, truly seen her. The only one who hadn't tried to erase her, the only one who hadn't tried to make her feel small. The phone buzzed again, and this time Marjorie didn't hesitate. The message wasn't from Ellie. It was from Renee. "The paperwork is filed. Everything is official. No going back now. They can't touch you. Marjorie placed the phone down, the weight of the moment settling in fully. This was it. There was nothing more to do. She had locked the doors, the house, the future. And for the first time in years, she felt at peace. The knock on the door was sharp and deliberate, like a challenge being thrown into the quiet of the room. It was a sound Marjorie had been anticipating, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She had been expecting a confrontation, but now that it was here, she felt a stillness settle over her. It wasn't fear or anxiety, it was more like the calm before the storm, as if the weight of the decisions she'd made, the shifts she had set into motion, had already become inevitable. She stood slowly from her chair, her legs steady, as her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. It was late, but she knew who it would be. Connor. It had to be. She could feel the tension in the air, thick with everything that had led up to this moment. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Marjorie crossed the room, the hardwood floor creaking under her feet as she walked toward the door. She reached out, her hand steady on the knob, and without a moment's hesitation, she opened it. Connor stood there, his posture rigid, a look of barely contained frustration on his face. The sight of him hit her like a wave, his eyes flashing with an impatience she had come to recognize all too well. He was the same as he had always been, expecting things to bend to his will, expecting people to follow his lead without question. But Marjorie had stopped following years ago. "Mom." Connor's voice was sharp, biting. "We need to talk. You can't just change things like this. What the hell's going on? What changed? I need to know why you're doing this." Marjorie didn't flinch. She stood there, her gaze unwavering, as she looked at him. His words weren't really a question. They were an accusation, a demand for an explanation that he felt entitled to. She could feel the years of resentment, the years of being treated as an afterthought, bubbling up inside her. But she didn't show it. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she repeated what had happened just a few short weeks ago, his behavior at Christmas. She wasn't going to hide it anymore. "You handed me a plastic plate, Connor. You pointed me to the folding table. You didn't even try to hide it. You wanted me to be a prop at your little holiday dinner, something to use and then forget about." Connor's face reddened, his mouth opening as if to argue, but she cut him off. "No," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've been silent for too long. You don't get to treat me like that anymore. You've been taking advantage of me for years, Connor. I let it happen because I thought you'd come around. But I'm done waiting for that. I'm not going to keep pretending that it's okay when it's not." His shock was immediate, a flicker of defensiveness flashing across his face. For a moment he seemed unsure of what to say, his words tripping over each other as he searched for an excuse. I didn't think it was a big deal. We just didn't have enough real plates. And you—" "No," she interrupted again, her voice cutting through the words. "It wasn't about plates, Connor. It was about respect. You treated me like I wasn't even worth the effort of a real plate. You didn't even think about what that meant to me." Connor's face tightened, the defensiveness shifting into a simmering anger. His jaw clenched, his posture bracing as if preparing for a confrontation he hadn't expected. "You're making this about something it's not. You don't get to make everything about you. You've changed, Mom. This whole thing, it's crazy." Marjorie stood her ground, her eyes never leaving his. "No. You've changed, Connor. You think the world owes you everything because you've got your own little family, your own little house. But you don't get to treat me like this anymore. This house isn't yours. It never was. I built this, and I'm the one who has the power to decide what happens here." The words hung in the air for a long moment, as if neither of them quite knew how to move forward. Connor's eyes darted to the side, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker of something. Shame, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a hardened look of defiance. "I don't get it, Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, though the edge was still there. "Why are you doing this? Why now? Why didn't you say something sooner?" Marjorie met his gaze, her eyes steady, unwavering. "Because I've been silent for too long. I let you both walk all over me, thinking I could just put up with it. But I'm done. This is my house, and I'm not going to sit at a folding table anymore. You don't get to treat me like this." Connor's shoulders slumped slightly, the tension in his body easing, but not enough. "So what? You're just cutting us out completely?" He laughed, but it was a bitter sound, empty of humor. "This is crazy. You're acting like I'm the enemy." "No," Marjorie said, her voice softening just a touch. "You're not the enemy, Connor. But you've been living like I don't matter, like I'm some kind of inconvenience. And I'm not. Not anymore. I can't keep pretending it's all okay when you've been treating me like this." The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Marjorie took a slow step back, breaking the tension. "I'm done arguing," she said. "You're welcome to stay, but nothing's going to change. Not unless you start treating me like I matter. You want to keep making excuses? Fine, but I'm not listening anymore." She stepped away from the door, moving past him with deliberate calm. But before she closed the door, she gave him one last look. "I'm done pretending, Connor," she said. "I hope you understand that." Connor stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, his expression one of disbelief. Then, without another word, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. Marjorie stood in the doorway, her pulse steadying as the weight of the moment began to settle in. She had done it. She had said what needed to be said. Behind her, she could hear the soft click of her phone, Renee's name flashing across the screen. She picked it up, her fingers hovering over the screen, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. The doorbell rang, loud and insistent, cutting through the stillness of the house. It felt like a jolt to the system, the kind of noise that always made Marjorie's pulse quicken. But this time, the sound wasn't just an interruption, it was a warning. A sign that whatever she had just finished with Connor was about to escalate. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she stood in the doorway, her back to the rest of the house, her hands folded in front of her. She had already said everything that needed to be said. She had drawn her line in the sand, made her final decisions. But now, with Dana's presence outside the door, she knew the conflict wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, as if Dana were trying to break through the silence that had settled in her wake. Marjorie didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped quietly to the side window, her eyes narrowing as she peered through the curtain. There, standing just beyond the porch light, was Dana. Her posture was rigid, her body language demanding. She had her hand raised, fist clenched, ready to strike again. Marjorie took a deep breath and watched her for a long moment. Dana's back was stiff, her shoulders squared with an air of superiority, as if she truly believed she was entitled to whatever space she wanted, whatever power she could still claim. But the door, this house, was no longer her domain. Marjorie didn't open the door. She wouldn't. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to argue about. Dana was looking for control, for a reaction, but Marjorie was done being anyone's target. She had spent years watching her family treat her as if she didn't matter, and now, that silence had been broken. She wouldn't go back. The banging started, loud and impatient. Dana's voice followed, strident and angry. "Marjorie, open the damn door! You're ruining this family. You're tearing everything apart. How could you do this?" The words were sharp, jagged, laced with fury. Dana's emotions were raw now, stripped away by whatever facade she had been hiding behind for all these years. There was no politeness now, no pretense, just the cold reality of what Dana really thought of Marjorie, the one she had always dismissed. Marjorie didn't flinch. She stayed where she was, her face unreadable. She wasn't going to let Dana's words penetrate her any longer. She had let them cut too deep in the past. But not now. Not anymore. The past was behind her, and Dana's words were no longer enough to undo everything she had worked for. As the banging continued, the front door creaked open slowly. Frank stepped out, his tall frame blocking the doorway, his presence solid and unyielding. His eyes were calm, but there was a sharpness to them now, a quiet force that made it clear to Dana that her act of intimidation wouldn't work here. "This isn't your home anymore, Dana," Frank said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You don't get to dictate the terms of this family. Not anymore." Dana's face twisted with disbelief, her mouth opening as if to argue, but she stopped herself. The reality of Frank's words had sunk in. And she could see that Marjorie wasn't the only one who had made up their mind. The house was hers. The life inside it was hers. Dana wasn't welcome in it anymore. "You think you can just throw me out like this?" Dana's voice broke, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're making a huge mistake, Marjorie. You're the one who's going to regret this. You're breaking this family apart." Frank's gaze didn't waver. "It's not your family to break anymore. You've done enough of that already." Dana opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered. Her anger was now tinged with something deeper, something almost desperate. She was losing her grip, and she could feel it. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, just as easily as Marjorie had dismantled them with her quiet strength. But Dana couldn't see that yet. All she saw was the loss of control she had once held over this house, over her mother-in-law, and over everything she had thought she could manipulate. "Fine," Dana spat, her voice low and tight with fury. "You'll regret this. You'll see. All of you." With one last venomous glare at Frank, she turned sharply and stormed off the porch, her boots crunching in the snow as she retreated, leaving Marjorie and Frank standing in the doorway. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Marjorie could feel the weight of everything hanging in the air. But as she stepped back into the house, she knew it was over. Dana wouldn't come back. Not like that. Not anymore. Frank turned to her, his expression softening, but only slightly. "You okay?" Marjorie nodded, though she didn't quite trust her voice yet. She was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer release of everything she had held inside. "I'm fine. I'm done. It's done." She reached for her phone on the counter and tapped Renee's name. The screen flickered to life with the new message thread. "It's time to finalize everything," Marjorie said quietly into the phone, her voice steady now. "Make sure it's locked in." Renee's response was immediate, sharp, and filled with purpose. "Consider it done. There's no turning back now." Marjorie took a long, steadying breath, her eyes focused on the door that had just been closed on a chapter she had been trying to escape for years. Now, she was free. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the quiet crackle of the fire in the hearth. Marjorie sat in her armchair, a warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hands loosely folded in her lap. It had been a long day, a long week. Everything was falling into place, and yet, the peace she had been searching for still felt like it was just beyond her reach. There was a weight to the silence, a finality in the air that made it feel like she was standing on the edge of something monumental, something irreversible. The door had closed on Dana, on the chaotic mess of years spent trying to please everyone except herself. But there was one last piece left to finalize, one last piece that would close the door once and for all on that chapter of her life. The certified notice from Renee had arrived that morning, tucked into an envelope so simple it felt almost anticlimactic, but the words inside were anything but. The trust and lien positions were confirmed, the final documents filed. Everything was now legally ironclad. The house was hers in a way it had never been before, not just in name, but in fact. The past no longer had any hold over her. She opened the envelope again, her fingers running lightly over the embossed seal as she looked over the paperwork one more time. Her name was at the top. Bold, clear, unambiguous. No more questions. No more disputes. This was it. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the room where Frank had left his workstation. He had been methodical in his approach, making sure that everything was updated. Digital access rights were now secure, and any lingering vulnerabilities were gone. Nothing, no one could break in again. Not emotionally, not physically, not legally. Marjorie placed the papers back in their folder and slid it into the drawer, her movements slow but deliberate. The weight of what she had done was settling into her bones like a comfortable coat. Fitting, protective, and warm. It had been a long time coming, but now that it was done, there was nothing left to do but breathe. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, cutting through the stillness. It was Ellie. Marjorie hesitated for a moment, her thumb brushing the screen before she swiped it open. The message was brief. Ellie didn't need to say much for it to carry all the weight of love and understanding. "I love you, Grandma." The words were simple, but they wrapped around Marjorie's heart like a balm, softening the edges of everything that had come before. Ellie was the one bright spot in all of this, the one person who had never looked at Marjorie with anything other than love and concern. Even when the rest of the family had turned away, Ellie had seen her. And now, for the first time, Marjorie felt seen in return. She listened to the voicemail, the sweet, tender tone of Ellie's voice carrying the words. It was a quiet, "I love you," said without fanfare, without any need for explanation. Just a simple, pure expression of connection. Marjorie listened to it twice, letting the words sink in deeper each time, allowing them to fill the empty spaces in her chest that had long been hollowed out by years of neglect. The storm outside had finally died down, leaving behind a fresh layer of snow on the ground. Marjorie rose from her chair, walking slowly to the window. The frosted glass blurred her view, but the world outside felt peaceful, still, uninterrupted. She placed her hand on the cold windowpane, watching as the white flakes continued to fall, each one settling gently on the earth. The world outside, just like the world inside, felt fresh again, untouched, ready for a new beginning. The phone buzzed once more, but this time, it wasn't Ellie. This time, it was Renee. "All final paperwork is securely stored. Your trust is protected. This is officially your home. No one can take it from you now." Marjorie closed her eyes for a moment, her hand still resting on the cool glass. The weight of the message settled over her, confirming everything she had done. There was no going back. No more doubts. No more manipulation. She was free. With a final, steadying breath, Marjorie opened the drawer and took out the folder. She held it for a moment, feeling the edges of the paperwork beneath her fingers, knowing that her life had changed in a way that could never be undone. The door had closed behind her, and now, the locks they couldn't open would stand as a silent sentinel over her future. The knock on the door was lighter this time, tentative, almost as if the visitor wasn't sure whether they should even be there. Marjorie didn't move at first. The knock came again, followed by a faint clearing of a throat. Then, finally, she stood and made her way to the door. Each step measured, as if she were crossing a threshold into something she had been waiting for all along. She opened it slowly, revealing a woman standing on the other side. The woman was dressed in a professional but plain outfit. A dark wool coat, scarf tied neatly, and a serious expression that didn't soften even when she introduced herself. "Marjorie Ellis?" the woman asked, glancing down at a clipboard in her hands. "Yes," Marjorie replied, her voice steady, the calmness she had earned over the past months still hanging in the air like a shield. "I'm Angela Morrow. I'm with the Adult Protective Services," the woman said, her tone neutral, almost clinical. "I've been assigned to evaluate your current living situation. I just need to ask a few questions, if that's all right." Marjorie's gaze flicked over the woman briefly, then she stepped aside to let her in. There was no hesitation, no argument. She knew what this was about. The whispers, the accusations, the legal maneuverings Dana and Connor had tried to instigate. The game had changed again, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their assumptions. Angela entered the house, her eyes taking in the surroundings, though her gaze didn't linger. She was focused, businesslike. The formality of it was almost comical, if not for the high stakes. "I assume you're aware of the inquiry?" Angela asked as they moved to the living room, where Marjorie had already prepared the paperwork. "Yes," Marjorie answered, pulling out a folder from a nearby desk, filled with medical assessments, old therapy records, and notes from doctors who had evaluated her over the years. "I've been keeping detailed logs, as you can see. I'm sure you'll find everything you need here." Angela flipped through the papers as she spoke. "We're required to determine that you're fully competent to manage your own affairs. Sometimes family members can become concerned about the well-being of elderly relatives, and it's standard procedure to evaluate that, especially when there are disagreements over property." Marjorie nodded, her fingers tightening on the edge of the armchair as Angela continued to sift through the documents. It felt like a test, a final inspection of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for over the past months. She was no stranger to being judged, to being scrutinized by others. But this felt different. This time, the judgment wasn't coming from a place of love or care. It was coming from a system that had been manipulated by people who didn't know her. "I've reviewed the assessments," Angela said, her voice neutral, as though the results didn't quite match what she had expected. She flipped through the last of the paperwork and gave Marjorie a long look. "Everything here is in order. You are fully competent, and there are no concerns about your ability to manage your finances, your property, or your life." Marjorie felt a sharp, relieved breath catch in her chest, but she didn't let herself relax. Not yet. Angela finished jotting something down on her clipboard and looked up at Marjorie with a measured expression. "I'll be filing my report soon. The paperwork will go to the county office, but from what I've seen, it's clear that you are more than capable of handling your own affairs." Marjorie stood up, her hand resting on the back of the chair for a moment before she moved toward the kitchen. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I'd appreciate a written copy of the report, if you don't mind." Angela nodded, making a few final notes. "Of course. I'll have it to you in a few days." As the woman left, Marjorie stood in the entryway, her hand on the door, feeling the weight of the moment. It was over. They had failed. The legal games Connor and Dana had tried to play had been thwarted. No one could argue against her competence now. No one could say she wasn't in full control of her own life. Marjorie closed the door behind her and stood in the stillness for a moment. The house was quiet again. She walked back to the living room, the last of the daylight fading through the window. As she sat down at the desk again, she could feel the finality of it all, settling into her bones like a heavy but comforting weight. The pieces were falling into place, and she could see the outlines of her future, clean and untarnished. The phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the stillness. It was Renee. "The final codicil is drafted." Renee's message read, "Connor and Dana have been removed from any future rights. You are legally secure. This is your home, Marjorie." Marjorie smiled to herself, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who had finally reached the end of a long road, someone who had fought for their peace and had earned it. She'd done what was necessary, and now, nothing would take this from her. She picked up the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, and then with a final deliberate motion she tapped out a response. "Thank you. I'm ready now." As she placed the phone down, her eyes moved to the refrigerator, where a small magnet held the note from Ellie. The simple sketch of Marjorie standing tall, holding the keys to her own future. Marjorie stood, her heart full. The final pieces were in place. Her future was hers again. The crisp morning air greeted Marjorie as she stepped outside, her shoes crunching lightly against the frost-covered path. Winter was still holding on, the world around her still cloaked in a white silence that mirrored the calm inside her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt an unfamiliar lightness, like the weight of years spent in emotional limbo had finally been lifted. She didn't have anywhere specific to go, but the urge to move was something she couldn't ignore. She'd been confined to her own thoughts for too long, and now, with the house secured, with the future officially hers, it felt like she could breathe again. Frank was already there, standing at the end of the sidewalk, a quiet presence. He had been a constant, a steady companion throughout this journey, someone whose calmness had always been a quiet anchor for her. "You ready?" he asked, a hint of a smile in his voice. Marjorie nodded. They'd started walking together each morning, a slow, grounding routine that gave her time to clear her mind and reconnect with the world outside her four walls. Frank's company was exactly what she needed. No need for words, just the rhythm of their steps as they moved forward together. As they walked, Marjorie's thoughts drifted back to the days before the changes, when she felt disconnected from her life. The guilt, the silence, the years spent accommodating everyone else's needs, quietly shrinking until the house that was supposed to be hers had become nothing more than a symbol of everything she had allowed to slip away. But that was no longer her reality. The house was hers now, and everything about it. From the foundation beneath her feet to the air she breathed inside, was hers to shape. It wasn't just the house, though. It was the life she had reclaimed for herself. She had started volunteering at the local library, helping to shelve books and chat with patrons, small acts that felt like moments of connection to a world she had neglected for far too long. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, and it gave her a quiet peace to be around people who didn't expect anything from her other than to be herself. Frank glanced at her as they reached the end of the street, his eyes soft but filled with the unspoken understanding that had formed between them. "You've been busy," he said, the weight of the words not lost on her. Marjorie gave a small smile. "I've had time to think. Time to do what I want. To live like I matter." She paused, glancing over at him. "It's strange. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding back until I stopped pretending I didn't care." The walk ended at the small bench by the town square. They paused for a moment, the quiet of the morning enveloping them, and Marjorie took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. She didn't know how to explain the shift she felt inside, how something as simple as walking again, breathing deeply again, had made her feel as though she were finally waking up. Frank turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly, a quiet smile playing at his lips. "You look lighter," he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. Marjorie felt a flush of warmth spread across her chest. It was true. She had changed, in ways she didn't think were possible. The weight that had been on her shoulders for years, the weight of doubt and regret, had been replaced with something else, something lighter, freer. She had taken back her life. They walked back toward her house, their steps in sync. When they reached the door, Marjorie felt the familiar comfort of being in her own space, a space that had felt foreign for so long. but now felt like home again. Inside, she moved to the desk where she had kept the important documents, the papers that had defined the battle she'd fought. They had been scattered across her table for weeks, kept out of sight but always on her mind. Now, with the finality of everything in place, it felt time to move them into something more permanent. She picked up the folder and walked to the back of the house, where her new keepsake box sat on the shelf. It was simple, solid, and sturdy. A metal box, beautifully engraved with her initials. It was hers. And inside it, she would store her trust documents, her keys, everything that symbolized the life she was now in control of. She carefully placed the folder inside and locked the box, her fingers brushing the smooth metal as she secured the lid. The simple action felt profound. It wasn't just about the papers. It was about closing the door on a past that had tried to take everything from her and sealing away the future she was now creating, one of her own design. Marjorie stepped back, her hand resting lightly on the box for a moment, feeling the weight of it. She wasn't just holding a box of papers. She was holding her life in all its complexity, in all its strength, in all its simplicity. The doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for just a moment, the sound of the bell still echoing in the silence of the house. After everything, after taking back her life and securing her peace, she knew she had no reason to fear whatever came next. With quiet resolve, she walked toward the door, her fingers already brushing the handle, ready for whatever awaited her on the other side. The snow had returned, coating everything in a soft, still layer. It was a typical December morning in Spokane, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch on forever, where the world outside could be a soft blur of white, and the world inside was equally muffled. Marjorie stood at her door, a small, neatly wrapped box in her hands, the weight of it lighter than the significance it carried. Ellie's gift. She hadn't forgotten. A month had passed since that explosive Christmas dinner, the one where everything had changed. The holidays that followed had been quiet, reflective. Marjorie had kept her distance from the family, from Connor and Dana, who, despite their attempts to reach out, never quite found a way back to her. Their lives had continued without her, but she knew, deep down, they were unraveling, even if they couldn't yet see it. Her absence was a fracture, one they hadn't expected, but now had to contend with. Today, she was returning to the house, not for reconciliation, but for one final act. Ellie needed her gift, and Marjorie knew, without question, that her granddaughter deserved to know the truth, no matter how awkward or painful it would be. She walked up the path, each step deliberate. She felt a steadiness in her body now, a confidence she had never known before. The woman who had been quietly resigned, the woman who had given and given, had learned how to say no. She had learned how to take back what was hers. The house loomed in front of her, familiar, but different. The energy had shifted. No longer was it a place where she had felt small, where her presence was ignored. Now it felt like a place she had once again made her own, even though it still echoed with the memories of battles lost. The door opened before she could ring the bell, as if they had been waiting for her, expecting her to show up, even though they didn't know how to act once she did. Connor stood there, a forced smile on his face, his posture rigid, but he made no move to embrace her. He looked the same, tired, worn down, but still carrying that sense of entitlement. Like the house was his by default, like he still had control of everything around him. Dana hovered behind him, her expression a mask of thinly veiled frustration. "Mom," Connor said, his voice strained, but he tried to sound normal. He failed. "Hi, Connor," Marjorie said, her voice calm, controlled. She didn't offer him the comfort he was expecting. Not anymore. Dana's eyes flicked to her, sharp and calculating. "So, You've decided to show up then? She asked, the words slipping out more like an accusation than a greeting. She had clearly expected Marjorie to stay away. Marjorie looked past Dana to Ellie, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, fidgeting. There was a nervousness in her movements, but it was tempered by something deeper. Something unspoken, as though Ellie already knew what was happening, but wasn't sure how to process it. "I've brought you something," Marjorie said, holding out the small box for Ellie, her voice softening as she handed it over. Ellie looked up at her, eyes wide, before she took the box, almost reverently, as if it were something much more than a simple gift. "What is it?" Ellie asked, her voice filled with that same quiet curiosity that Marjorie loved so much. Marjorie smiled, watching as Ellie carefully unwrapped the gift, her small hands moving with a grace that made Marjorie's chest tighten with affection. It was a key. Simple, metal, engraved with Marjorie's initials. It was a symbolic key, a key to the future, a key to a life where she mattered, where she wasn't just an afterthought. And now, it was Ellie's. A gift, not of wealth or property, but of something far more meaningful. Control over her own choices. Marjorie watched as Ellie's face transformed from confusion to realization, and then a quiet, knowing smile. Ellie held it in her hand for a long moment, turning it over and over. "It's a key," Ellie whispered. "To what?" "To everything," Marjorie replied simply. "To the future." Dana's eyes flicked back to Marjorie, and then to the key in Ellie's hand. The change in her demeanor was instantaneous, as though a switch had been flipped. She was no longer masking her disdain. Her voice dropped, thick with bitterness. "So, this is how it's going to be, huh? You're cutting us out completely? You're really going to leave us with nothing?" Frank stepped forward at that moment, his presence like a quiet force that filled the space between them. "It was never yours to begin with," he said calmly, his voice steady but firm. Dana's face turned pale, her mouth tightening as she glanced at Connor, whose expression had shifted from irritation to something darker, something closer to disbelief. Marjorie reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the final stack of paperwork, the official trust documents, and the codicil Renee had finalized just days ago. She handed it to Dana, who took it with trembling hands, her gaze flickering over the words. The legal language was unambiguous. "You're excluded," Marjorie said, her tone matter of fact, but not without a hint of sadness. "This house, this future, it's mine, and it's Ellie's. That's all that matters now." Dana's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing her face as she read the words on the page. The truth, as clear and sharp as the cold winter air, was right there in black and white. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to fight for. Marjorie turned toward the door, her back straight, her steps measured, her dignity intact. She didn't need to look back. She didn't need to say anything else. As she stepped outside, she heard Dana's voice, thin with disbelief, trailing after her. "You'll regret this," she spat, but the words held no weight anymore. Marjorie walked away, the cold air biting at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She had given them what they deserved, and she had done it with grace. The keys were hers now, and in time, they would be Ellie's. "They gave me a plastic plate," Marjorie whispered to herself as she walked away, a quiet satisfaction filling her heart. "So, I gave them plastic locks,"